I always thought stories of betrayal began with clear signs: frequent arguments, emotional distance, cold silences that screamed louder than words. Mine didn't start like that. Mine began so quietly that, for a long time, I believed that nothing in the world could break it. If someone had asked me, back then, who was the person I trusted most in the world, I wouldn't have needed to think. It wouldn't be my family. It wouldn't be my friends. It would be him, my husband. I said this with pride, not as someone repeating something nice, but as someone stating a fact. Trusting him was as natural as breathing. It was never a conscious decision. It was never something I needed to reinforce. The trust simply existed, solid, silent, constant. We didn't have a perfect marriage. We never did. But we had something that, for me, was more valuable: stability. A predictable, safe, almost too comfortable routine. And I thought that's how mature relationships worked. We almost always woke up at the same time. The alarm clock would ring, he would complain quietly, turn to the side and pretend he still had 5 more minutes of life before facing the day. I would laugh. I always laughed. He would open one eye, stare at me, and pull the blanket back, as if that gesture could delay the world outside. We made coffee together, not because it was romantic, but because it was practical. I would prepare the coffee, he would set the table. Sometimes we would talk, sometimes not, and the silence never bothered me. On the contrary, I thought it was beautiful to share silence with someone. We met at a time when I was still trying to understand who I was. I came from confusing relationships, full of empty promises and predictable endings. He appeared different, observant, calm. A kind of tranquility that demanded nothing from me but presence. He remembered small things: the way I drank coffee, the fact that I needed a few minutes alone when something bothered me, from my strange habit of organizing my thoughts while walking. That made me feel seen, and over time, safe. When we started living together, nothing changed drastically. There was no clash of realities, no major conflicts. Everything seemed to fit together with an almost suspicious ease, but at the time I called it compatibility. The wedding was small, few people, nothing extravagant. We smiled genuinely in the photos. Not that rehearsed smile, but the smile of someone who believes they are making the right choice. And for a long time, I was sure I was. Our life together was made of almost invisible details: grocery shopping, arguing about which brand was better, movies we never finished because one of us fell asleep on the couch, conversations about the future that weren't in a hurry to happen. I never felt the need to check his phone. I never asked for passwords. I never questioned schedules. Not because I was naive, but because trusting him was natural. Not because I was naive, but because trusting him was part of who I was. Questioning him would be like questioning the ground beneath my feet. I believed I knew every version of him: the professional, the partner, the tired man at the end of the day, the silent man on Sunday mornings. I believed there were no hidden layers, that everything was there, visible, accessible. And perhaps that's what hurts the most today. Today, looking back, I realize how comfortable that security was, how it prevented me from questioning, how it kept me in the right place so I couldn't see beyond what I wanted to see. When small changes occurred, a delay, an unexpected trip, an interrupted conversation, I always found a logical explanation. Work, stress, adult life, nothing that justified distrust. I believed that true love didn't need surveillance. Trusting him wasn't something I did. It was something I was. But back then I called it balance. My trust in him was so deep that I couldn't imagine my life without that structure. We were a couple that worked, at least on the outside, at least in what I could see. I never thought that love could be a false construct. I never thought that someone could invest so much time being someone they weren't. I believed that lies were tiring, that no one could sustain a double life for very long. I was wrong, but I didn't know it yet. On the last night before everything changed, we had dinner together as usual. We talked about small things. He told me a trivial story from work. I complained about being tired. We laughed at something silly that came on television. Before going to sleep, he kissed me on the forehead. "I love you," he said. And I answered without hesitation. I didn't know that the trust I felt, that feeling of absolute stability, was exactly what made me most vulnerable. Because when you completely trust someone, you're never prepared for the first crack. And it was already there, silent, just waiting for the phone to ring. There are events that don't arrive like explosions. They arrive like a detail out of place. Mine began on an absolutely ordinary day, so ordinary that if I could go back in time, I would never suspect that it would mark the end of the life I knew. It was a normal morning. The same light coming through the window. The same distant sound of the street. The same smell of coffee. He had already left early for work, as he did on certain days of the week. Nothing different. Nothing that caught my attention. I was in the middle of a mundane task when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. I always ignored unknown numbers. But something I can't explain, made me answer. "Hello?" There was a brief silence on the other end. Not the silence of a bad call, but the silence of someone choosing their words carefully. "Are you Daniel's wife?" the voice asked. My first impulse was to answer automatically. Simply, yes. But something in that tone made me hesitate. "I am... Who is speaking?" He took a deep breath. I heard it clearly, as if he were preparing to go through something difficult. "My name doesn't matter now," he said. "What matters is that you need to know something." My whole body went on alert. Not fear yet, more like a sudden discomfort, a silent intuition. "Know what?" I asked. He hesitated again, and then he said the phrase that shattered everything I believed to be solid. "Your husband isn't who you think he is." For a few seconds I couldn't respond. My mind tried to fit that phrase into some logical place, tried to laugh at it, tried to dismiss it as a mistake, a scam, a person's error. "You must be mistaken," I said finally. "I think you dialed the wrong number." "I wish I were," he replied. "Believe me, I really wish I were." My first reaction was to hang up, but I didn't. Not because I believed him, but because something inside me needed to hear it to the end, even if it was just to confirm that it didn't make sense. "What are you talking about?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was lower. "There are things Daniel does, lives he lives, that you don't know about." I felt an irritation growing. Not sadness, not fear. Irritation. How dare someone speak that way about the man I loved? "Look, that's inappropriate," I said. "If you have a problem with him, deal with him." There was a long pause. Then he said something that made me freeze. He said that to everyone. Everyone. That word hung in the air. "Everyone who?" I asked, feeling my heart race for the first time. "The people who believed they were the only version." He replied. My next impulse was to hang up, and this time, I hung up. I stared at the phone for several minutes. My reflection on the blank screen looked strange, as if I were seeing someone I didn't fully recognize. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that anyone could make up a story like that Daniel was a respected, predictable, transparent man. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, something had already changed. The day went on, but I couldn't concentrate on anything. Everything seemed slightly out of focus. Every thought returned to that call, even when I tried to push it away. When Daniel arrived home that night, I observed him as I never had before, not looking for fault, looking for difference. He kissed me as always, asked about my day, told me something banal about work, everything perfectly aligned with the life I knew, and that disturbed me more than any strange behavior could, because if someone was lying, it was a flawless lie. I thought about confronting him right then and there. The words came to my lips several times, but they wouldn't come out, not because I was afraid of the answer, but because I had nothing but an absurd connection and a bad feeling, and I didn't want to be the person who destroys something real because of a vague doubt. That night, I barely slept. I listened to his breathing beside me. Regular, calm. The sound of someone with no weight on their chest. I wondered if that man could really be hiding something so big. If I could have lived beside someone without ever realizing it. In the morning, I was already tired. And then the phone rang again. The same number. This time, I answered. "I shouldn't have called," he said before I could say anything. "But now I can't pretend you don't exist." I asked why. "Because you're not the only one," he replied. "And because someone needs to know the truth before it destroys more people." I felt a tightness in my chest, not because I fully believed it, but because a part of me couldn't dismiss it anymore. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted you to be prepared." "Prepared for what?" He didn't answer directly. "Observe," he said simply. "Don't confront. Don't question yet. Just observe." The call dropped, and that's when something fundamental changed in me. Until that moment, I was still the woman who trusted completely. After that call, I became someone who paid attention. I started revisiting old memories, conversations, trips, situations that, at the time, seemed too normal to be questioned. Nothing screamed betrayal. Nothing confirmed anything. But now there was room for doubt. And when doubt finds space, it grows. I still loved my husband. That didn't change that day. But for the first time, I realized something terrifying. Love doesn't prevent secrets. Trust doesn't prevent well-constructed lies. And while I tried to keep my life running as before, I knew, deep down, that something had already been broken. Not with proof, not with facts, but with a simple phrase, spoken by an unknown voice. "Your husband isn't who you think he is." And that phrase wouldn't leave my head. After the second call, I couldn't pretend that nothing had changed anymore. On the outside, my life continued exactly the same. I woke up at the same time, did the same things, answered the same messages. I smiled when I needed to smile. I talked when I needed to talk. But inside, something was constantly on alert. It was like living in a house where you start hearing small creaks at night. Nothing collapses. Nothing breaks immediately. But you know that something is slowly shifting out of your control. I started to observe. Not in an obvious way. Not as someone searching for proof. I observed him like someone trying to understand a new language, paying attention to patterns, pauses, and repetitions. I noticed that Daniel had stories that never progressed. He would start telling something, and in the middle of it, change the subject. As if too many details were dangerous, as if improvising were risky. I also noticed how he reacted to simple questions. He didn't get nervous. On the contrary, he answered too quickly, too confidently, like someone who had already thought of the answer before the question even existed. And that started to bother me deeply. I began to notice the silences, not the long ones but the short ones, those that last seconds but reveal a lot. Silences that arise before a seemingly innocent answer. I still didn't interfere. I didn't invade. I didn't snoop. I needed to understand if all of that was in my head. One night, while he was taking a shower, his cell phone vibrated on the table. It wasn't a call. It was a message. The screen lit up briefly, showing only part of the text. A name I didn't recognize. A phrase too neutral to be casual. I turned my face away. I didn't pick up the phone, but that image stayed with me. When he came out of the bathroom, he acted normally. He picked up his cell phone. He answered something quickly. He put it in his pocket. No sign of tension. No change in behavior. That's what scared me the most, because if there was guilt, I might acknowledge it. But what I saw was control. Days later, I received another call. The same voice. "You've started to notice, haven't you?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately. "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied. He let out a light sigh. "I told you you would notice," he continued. "He doesn't change, he just adjusts." I asked how he knew so much. He hesitated. "Because I've been on the other side," he said. I believed a version that wasn't complete. He started to tell more, not scandalous details, not explicit scenes. He spoke of subtle promises, of long conversations, of plans that never materialized, but that seemed real while they existed. "He makes you feel unique," he said, "but never whole." That hit me hard. Unique, but not whole. I hung up feeling an enormous weight on my chest, not because I had concrete proof, but because for the first time, the story of that unknown man fit too well into the life I was living. I started to remember situations that previously seemed insignificant. Dates when Daniel said he was busy, trips that came up at the last minute, meetings that never had specific names. Everything always made sense, until it didn't. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask for explanations. I needed to be sure, or at least something close to it. One afternoon, while going through old documents, I found travel records that didn't match what I remembered. Nothing illegal, nothing explicit, just inconsistent. I felt a knot in my stomach. It wasn't a clear betrayal. It was something colder. It was duplicity. I began to understand that the problem wasn't just what he did. It was who he was when I wasn't looking. I started to notice how he separated parts of his life, how friends never mixed, how stories never intersected, how everything was compartmentalized. That wasn't carelessness. It was method. And then came the conversation that changed everything. We were having dinner, talking about something trivial. At a certain point, he mentioned a work meeting on a specific date. I froze. I remembered that day exactly. We had spent the afternoon together. I had photos, clear memories. He wasn't where he said he was. I didn't correct him. I didn't confront him. I just listened. And it was there, in that silent moment, that doubt turned into emotional certainty. Not because I knew the whole truth, but because I knew he was lying naturally. That night I received another call. "You heard the lie," the voice said. It wasn't a question. "Why does he do this?" I asked, feeling tears welling up. "Because he needs versions," he replied, "and because none of them know the whole story." I asked who else knew. He didn't answer directly. "More people than there should be," he simply said. I hung up feeling something break inside me. It wasn't anger. It was deep disappointment. The kind that doesn't explode. It just sinks. I was married to someone I didn't fully know, and he was comfortable with that. In the following days, I felt torn between two people, the woman who loved her husband and the woman who saw the cracks. I still shared the bed with him. I still said, "I love you." But something had changed forever, because at that point, I already knew. The truth wouldn't come as a confession. It would come as a breakdown, and I was getting closer and closer to the moment when all the versions would meet, even without knowing how, even without knowing when. I only knew one thing. Nothing was under control, and the worst part was that he still thought he was. After the day I heard that lie slip out of his mouth so casually, I stopped trying to save anything inside me. Not the marriage, not the image I had built, not even the woman I used to be. I entered a strange state of lucidity. It wasn't calm, it was clarity. I no longer needed more calls to know that something was deeply wrong, but they continued. This time, I didn't answer immediately. I let the phone ring until it almost fell out. Part of me wanted silence. Another part needed to hear everything to the end. When I answered, the voice on the other end sounded different, less restrained. "He's starting to lose control," he said. "Over what?" I asked. "Over the versions," he replied. "They're getting too close." That sentence chilled me. Versions shouldn't meet, shouldn't mix, shouldn't collide, but that's exactly what was about to happen. He started telling me things I didn't already know. Not full names, not addresses, but parallel stories, promises made at different times, words repeated to different people, the same phrases, the same guarantees, the same lies. "He doesn't lie by improvising," the man said. "He lies by construction." I felt nauseous. It wasn't an impulsive betrayal. It was architecture. I hung up without saying anything. That night, Daniel arrived later than usual. He said the flight was delayed. He said he was exhausted. He said he just wanted to sleep. I listened to everything in silence. When he lay down beside me, I realized something that deeply frightened me. I no longer felt anything when I touched him. No anger, no immediate pain, just distance. The next day, I did something I never thought I would do. I confirmed it. Not with desperate invasion, but with method. I cross-referenced dates, I checked old records, I connected stories that should never coexist. Everything was too clean, too organized, as if someone had spent their entire life learning to hide. And then I understood. Daniel wasn't living a double life. He lived fragmented lives. Each person received a part. None received the whole. I was the foundation, the stability, the fixed point. Without me, the other versions wouldn't hold up. When this understanding hit me, I cried for the first time since the beginning of it all. It wasn't a loud cry. It was silent, almost respectful. I was mourning something that never truly existed. That week, he began to notice my change. He asked if everything was all right. He said I seemed distant. He tried to be affectionate. It was too late. That night, the phone rang again. "Tomorrow," the voice said, "everything will fall apart." "How?" I asked. "Because someone decided not to accept an incomplete version anymore." My heart raced. "You?" I asked. There was a long pause. "No," he replied. "Someone else." He hung up. I spent that night awake, sitting in the living room, looking at old photos, trying to identify when I had loved someone who didn't exist. In the morning, Daniel left in a hurry. He said he had an important meeting. He didn't kiss me before leaving. It was the first time. Hours later, I received a message from an unknown number. Just one sentence. "You need to come now." An address. I didn't reply. I just went. When I arrived, I saw something I will never forget. Daniel was there. Pale, confused, disoriented. And he wasn't alone. There was another woman. There were no screams. There was no scandal. There was shock. She looked at me as if she were looking into a broken mirror. I understood immediately. She also believed she was the main version. He tried to speak, tried to explain, tried to organize words that were never meant to coexist. But there was no more space. The versions had met, and neither of them would survive intact. While he spoke, I realized something cruelly ironic. That was the first time I had seen Daniel truly lost, without a script, out of control. And it was there that I understood that the truth doesn't only destroy those who believe in it, it destroys those who live to hide it. I stepped away, without screaming, without accusing, because some truths are so great that they don't need words. And as I left that place, I knew. The end hadn't come yet. But now, it was inevitable. After that encounter, I didn't go home immediately. I drove aimlessly for a time I can't measure. The streets seemed unreal, as if I were crossing a stage scene for someone who was no longer part of the story. I didn't cry. Not yet. My body seemed to have entered survival mode. Every thought came too organized, every emotion too distant. It was as if I were observing my own life from the outside. When I finally returned home, the house didn't recognize me. Everything was exactly in the same place. The sofa, the photos, his clothes still in the closet. But none of it seemed to belong to me. It was like living in a museum of a life that ended without warning. The phone rang. I didn't answer. It rang again. I answered. "He's desperate," said the voice I knew so well, trying to pick up the pieces. "I don't care," I replied, and I was surprised by the firmness of my own voice. There was silence on the other end. "You know this doesn't end here," he said. "It never ends." I hung up. For the first time since the beginning of everything, I didn't want any more answers. Because I had already understood the essential. Daniel would never be able to tell the whole truth. Not to me, not to anyone. That night, he came home late. I was sitting at the kitchen table, in the dark. Not because I wanted to make a scene, but because I still didn't have the strength to pretend everything was normal. When he came in, he was startled to see me there. "We need to talk," he said. I didn't answer. He started talking anyway. Words rushed together, incomplete sentences, desperate attempts to organize a narrative that no longer held up. He said I was misinterpreting everything. He said things were more complex. He said he never meant to hurt me. I listened to everything, and then I asked the only question that mattered. Which version should I believe? He remained silent, and that silence answered everything. I stood up. I walked to the bedroom. I started packing some things. Nothing dramatic, nothing impulsive, just what was necessary. He followed me, begging me to stay, promising transparency, change, therapy, anything that sounded like salvation. I stopped and looked at him. "You don't lie because you're weak," I said. "You lie because you need to exist in fragments." He started to cry. But it was too late. I left that night. Not angry, not hateful, with a clarity that hurt more than any explosive emotion. The following days were strange, silent, empty. People called me. Friends kept asking. I answered little, as if any explanation would be too big to fit into words, until I received one last call, the same number. "He knows you left," the voice said, "and he's trying to save himself." "Saving what?" I asked. "The image," he replied. "It's always been that." He hesitated before continuing. "There's something you don't know yet." My stomach churned. "What?" "You were never the first version." I felt breathless. He explained, with cruel calm. Daniel had been living that way long before me. I wasn't the beginning. I was the refinement, the most convincing version, the marriage that made all the other stories possible. You were the anchor, he said. Without you, nothing would work. When the call ended, I finally cried, not for him, but for myself, for having been chosen not for love, but for usefulness. Weeks later, I learned the final outcome. One of the other versions decided to expose everything. Messages, dates, intertwined stories, not for revenge, but out of exhaustion. Daniel's name began to circulate, not in newspapers, not in headlines, but in the kind of space where reputations truly die, silent word of mouth. He tried to call me dozens of times. I never answered. Months passed. One day, I met the man with the unfamiliar voice in person. By chance. In an ordinary place. An ordinary face. A weariness I immediately recognized. "I'm sorry," he said. "Me too," I replied. And it was true. Before leaving, he told me something I've never forgotten. He never knew how to love someone completely because he was never whole. Today, when I look back, I understand something that took a while to hurt less. I trusted my husband completely. And that wasn't a mistake. The mistake was believing that trust prevents someone from lying. Because some people don't cheat out of desire. They cheat because of structure. And the relationship that destroyed my life wasn't the beginning of the end. It was just the moment I stopped living an incomplete version of the truth. And in the end, surviving wasn't about forgiving. It was about not accepting being just a part of someone's lie.
Se esse tipo de história te prende, você sabe onde ficar. Curta, comente e se inscreva no nosso canal e não perca as próximas histórias.